Do we really need your eyes on every single spreadsheet, Jeffrey? Bradley sneered, waving a thick corporate acquisition folder like a fly swatter. It is operations, not open-heart surgery, he added with a dry chuckle. He looked around, expecting the others to laugh. Nobody did. It was his first week as chief operating officer, and he was already rearranging the furniture, throwing out buzzwords like confetti, convinced the firm needed saving from itself. I did not blink. I just sat there, taking a slow sip of my tea while my eyes scanned the spreadsheet he had just marked up with red ink. He looked like a child who had gone wild with a marker. Bradley had not even noticed that the asset rollover structure was empty. There was no filing index, and there was no risk clearance check. He also had not noticed that I was not writing anything down, because I already knew every line by heart. People used to call me the Vault back when the executives still had the intelligence to ask for my input. I had spent 15 years in operations, and for 8 of those, I was the one silently patching every strategic error and compliance gap the senior executives left behind. No one ever clapped for the machine running in the dark. But when the system buckled, I already had the recovery manual signed before anyone else realized there was a leak. Now, Bradley had come from a rival firm, bringing a massive ego that he swung like a wrecking ball. He called me the ops guy in front of our interns. He slashed my project list down to almost nothing to narrow my focus, and he even sent my yearly performance bonus to the board for reevaluation. He did not fire me. He did something worse. He tried to make me disappear. Before the week ended, I found myself left off the invite list for the acquisition planning session. My name was deleted from the email chain, and my contact at the private equity firm had not returned my messages. Bradley had restructured the workflow, claiming it was for efficiency, which was just his polite word for cutting my throat. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not go to human resources. I just adjusted. I quietly removed my nameplate from the glass door of my office and returned to my desk. But something in the system had changed. I opened a private folder buried 6 levels deep inside our access control servers. It was labeled Internal Clearance Conditional Triggers, version 2.1. My initials were tagged on a specific compliance clause that I had written 4 years ago during a quiet regulatory update. Most people did not know this code existed, but the database remembered. It was the exact type of compliance trigger that you never think about until someone makes a massive, arrogant mistake. Across the hall, Bradley laughed too loudly at his own jokes. The junior analysts smiled like hostages. I clicked one validation box on my screen to make my token active as the assigned certifier. Nobody noticed. By Monday, the mood in operations had shifted. My team could feel that something was coming. Some of the younger staff brought their draft reports to my desk for unofficial reviews. A few asked if they should sign off on financial spreadsheets that they had not personally put together. I gave them quiet nods or small shakes of my head. I did not say much. My silence carried weight. During my lunch break, I saw the quarterly roadmap Bradley had pinned up near the break room. My name was nowhere on the chart, but the logo of the private equity firm, Stonehaven Holdings, was printed right at the top. That partnership was an issue because I had built that relationship from the ground up. I still remembered the day I walked into their Manhattan office to meet their lead partner, Roger Albright. He refused to shake hands with operations staff, but I earned his respect in 30 minutes by identifying a $400,000 accounting error that his own analysts had missed. After that, Roger told me they only trusted my numbers, not my bosses. Now that trust was going to be put to the test. I returned to my desk, opened a simple text file, and began typing a timeline. It was not for human resources, and it was certainly not for Bradley. It was for me. I named the file Contingency Timeline for Unvalidated Triggers. Right below the title, I wrote a single sentence in bold text. If they exclude you from the meeting, make sure they cannot close the deal without you. I watched from my desk as moving boxes were rolled past my office. 3 directors were let go before noon, and 2 vice presidents were transitioned into consulting roles, which was just corporate speak for leaving before Friday. They were replaced by Bradley's hand-picked associates, who had followed him from whatever sinking ship he had last managed to run into an iceberg. They walked around the office smelling of expensive cologne and showing off mediocre presentation slides. One actually high-fived the receptionist on his first day, and another called our monthly revenue forecast cute, suggesting we rename it the Big Boy Budget. I did not flinch. I just adjusted my headset, kept my tracker dashboard minimized, and kept moving. By Thursday morning, my calendar had been completely stripped clean. Meetings that I had personally scheduled and led for 8 years were canceled without a word of explanation. Email threads that I had started now read like abandoned digital ghost towns, with Bradley and his new associates talking past me as if I were a line of code they had already commented out. Instead of giving me a direct heads up, Bradley simply reassigned my operations work in pieces, like carving up a Thanksgiving turkey and tossing me the leftover bones. I was no longer copied on the emails regarding the Stonehaven Holdings acquisition, and my access to our primary vendor portal had been changed to read-only. When I identified a double billing issue and flagged it to accounting, the reply I got was a single shrugging emoji from an analyst named Sarah, who typed everything in lowercase. The final blow came when the internal project tracker updated my role on the integration team to administrative oversight optional. That word, optional, hung there like an insult. I did not complain, and I did not write an angry message. I simply took a slow breath, closed my eyes for 3 seconds, and clicked into a database directory that I had not touched since the last acquisition cycle. Under the Operations folder, in the Internal Controls and Legacy Clauses section, I found the file for certification tokens. I scrolled down to the line marked Validation Assignment, Legacy Systems Only, and changed the security access to token JVAuth 914 exclusive. Then I quietly saved the archive, encrypted the backup file, and forwarded a soft copy to my private storage. That single line of security update seemed completely harmless. It was just a small piece of technical language buried in the background code, but it was like burying a digital landmine under a freshly polished wood floor. No one would see it until they stepped on the exact floorboard. Over the next week, I built a private timeline in my personal notes. I documented every meeting I was removed from, every task that was reassigned without notice, and every financial database that was edited without my required review. I did not assign blame, and I did not write down my emotional reactions. I simply logged the facts like a forensic scientist collecting evidence before the crime even took place. It was not paranoia. It was survival. I knew that Bradley was betting on me leaving quietly. Operations managers are not flashy. We do not make the front pages of business websites, and we do not give pitches to investors. But that is the thing about structural support. You never notice the scaffolding of a building until someone rips it out and the walls begin to creak. The younger analysts in the office were already beginning to sense that the foundation was shaking. One afternoon, Hannah, a junior analyst who had only been with us for 6 months, stopped by my desk. She leaned in and spoke in a quiet whisper, asking if it was normal for the finance team to skip the validation step on the third quarter projection reports. I looked up from my tea and asked her if she had signed the report. She hesitated, looking nervous, and said no. I told her that was good and that she should not sign it. Then I went back to my typing. The word spread quickly through the department. By the end of the day, 3 different team members had forwarded documents to my inbox, asking for a quick look before they submitted them. They treated me like a compliance whisperer who could see the hidden traps in Bradley's new processes. Bradley, meanwhile, was walking around the office like a king who had just conquered a new territory. He hosted loud status meetings with the conference room doors wide open, shouting buzzwords like synergy and throwing out the old guard. He called me steady hands when he passed my desk like he was greeting a bartender at the end of a long night. I only responded to him once when he asked if I had reviewed the vendor invoices for the Stonehaven Holdings acquisition. I told him that the invoices were no longer in my lane. He nodded, looking very pleased. That was the exact moment I knew I had become completely invisible. But being invisible meant I could move through the office without anyone paying attention to my actions. That night, I reopened the operations database and added another instruction to the compliance playbook. It was a simple rule. All final validation on legacy mergers and acquisitions must be certified by the assigned token holder. It was a single point of sign-off, with no override permitted, without a digital signature from the original certifier. Then I logged out of the system, pushed my chair back, and walked to my car like nothing had changed. On Friday, the rain was coming down hard, matching the gray mood of the office. I opened my inbox and saw an email from a name I had not seen in weeks. It was Roger Albright, the senior partner at Stonehaven Holdings. The subject line asked if everything was all right. Inside the message was a single simple sentence. Roger wrote that my absence from the acquisition calls had been noted, and he hoped I was doing well. I stared at the screen for a moment, watching the cursor blink. Then I typed a short reply. I told him I was just observing the process. I did not include a professional sign-off or any additional context. I knew Roger would understand what those words meant. We had worked together on 2 major audits and closed a $70 million deal during a winter storm while half the board was stuck in an airport. He was smart and paranoid. He knew what my silence implied. I hit send and archived the exchange. The automated system alert came in at 6:43 in the morning, while the rest of the office was still fast asleep. I was already sitting at my desk. I always preferred the early morning hours when the office was empty, the air was cool, and I had complete control over my workspace. The email was from the internal security database. The subject line read Validation Exception Certifier Flag, and it identified the token as JV Auth 914. I opened the message without any rush. The system log showed that an attempt had been made at 3:14 in the morning to clear a transaction. It was vendor invoice 44B for the amount of $10 million. The user who tried to bypass the security check was logged as Bradley Ward. The status of the transaction was marked as incomplete, and the reason given was the missing validation token. I did not react. I did not panic. I simply took a slow sip of my warm tea, minimized the database window, and opened my private contingency log. I added a new entry at 6:43 in the morning. System ping on the $10 million invoice. Validation token missing, processed by accounting but uncleared. I did not forward the alert to the legal department, and I did not notify the compliance team. I did not even print the report. The database had already recorded the event, and the database does not forget. Bradley could walk through the halls showing off his presentation slides, and he could rename as many departments as he wanted, but none of that would rewrite the back-end code I had built before his name was ever entered into our company directory. At that exact moment, I could hear Bradley's voice booming from his corner office across the hall. He was on speakerphone, talking to one of the vice presidents. He declared that compliance was already baked into the transaction, claiming that his new team was agile and did not believe in over-engineering the approval process. He told the vice president that they were moving fast and making progress. I watched him through the glass partition. He was standing with one hand in his pocket and his chin raised, looking like he was posing for a corporate website headshot. It was the posture of a man who had never reconciled a ledger in his life, but talked constantly about burn rates and strategic vision. I pulled up the active transaction flow logs on my screen. The $10 million invoice had indeed been marked as processed by the accounting department overnight, likely because they were trying to clean up the accounts before the end of the month. Reports were sent to the board of directors, but the actual status of the transfer was still glowing red on the ledger. It read uncleared, awaiting validation token. When I opened the back-end audit trail, I saw something even more interesting. There had been 4 separate override attempts from Bradley's account over the past 36 hours. Every single one of them had failed, and each attempt was logged with an exact timestamp. I felt a small smile touch my face. It was not a happy smile, but the kind of quiet satisfaction a craftsman feels when he knows his work is solid. Back in the main office area, the junior staff members were moving around with nervous energy. They did not know exactly what was wrong, but they could feel that something was off, like the drop in air pressure before a major storm hits. Hannah walked past my desk and stopped, giving me a worried look. She whispered that she had heard the finance team was in a panic over a processing delay, and that Bradley was blaming the technical infrastructure. I took a sip of my tea and suggested that they try turning the servers off and on again. Hannah blinked in confusion, and I returned to my work. A few minutes later, another notification appeared on my legacy compliance dashboard. It was a high-level system warning. Audit trigger escalated. Acquisition review flagged for manual intervention. This was the specific rule I had written years ago. It stated that if any corporate transaction exceeding $5 million failed to receive clearance from the assigned certifier, the system would immediately freeze all related actions. Once a transaction entered this manual intervention state, only two entities could unlock it. The first was the originating certifier, using the specific token. The second was a formal vote from the board of directors. I added one more line to my private log. Intervention status triggered. Board of directors notification expected within 72 hours. I closed the terminal window and sat back in my chair. I let the silence settle around me, let Bradley brag to the executives, and let his team scramble to find a workaround. I did not have to raise my voice or make a scene. All I had to do was absolutely nothing. By the time Monday morning arrived, Bradley was walking around the building, looking like he had just saved the firm single-handedly. He was flashing a self-congratulatory grin and talking about full alignment. At 9 o'clock, a company-wide email was sent to everyone. Bradley wrote that he was proud to share that all compliance steps for the Stonehaven Holdings acquisition were complete and that they were on track to close the deal by the end of the week. He thanked his new Agile team for making it happen. I read the email with one eyebrow raised. Then I refreshed the validation database. The status was unchanged. Invoice 44B uncleared, 6 failed override attempts. Bradley was telling the investors the transaction was finished, but the system was still holding the line. At 10:17 in the morning, I received an encrypted message routed through my compliance archive alias. The sender was Roger Albright, the senior partner at Stonehaven Holdings. The subject line read Final Validation Certificate Status Inquiry. The message was short and direct. Roger wrote that their team had received confirmation from our office that all validation steps were complete. However, before they could release the final tranche of funding, they needed my signature as the registered certifier to satisfy their internal checklist. He asked me to confirm that the numbers were validated. I stared at the message for a full minute, watching the cursor blink. Then, with careful precision, I composed my response. I wrote that I could not confirm the validation. I attached a copy of the official memo outlining Compliance Clause 8.1 and stated that my token was active and no clearance had been authorized. The attached memo was 2 pages long, written in dense but clear legal language. It outlined the single-point certifier protocol. It stated that in any acquisition, merger, or asset transfer exceeding $5 million, a single-point certifier must issue final digital clearance using their unique token. Any attempt to bypass this protocol by non-token holders would automatically flag the transaction as unvalidated and trigger an intervention hold. The certifier on record was listed as Jeffrey Vance, with the token identification JVAuth914. I did not copy Bradley on the email, and I did not copy our legal team. I did not need to do so. By 11:12, I received a read receipt from Stonehaven Holdings. 3 minutes later, my office phone rang, showing an unlisted number. I did not answer it. Instead, I sent a brief text message to Roger with 3 words: chain of custody. By 2:47 in the afternoon, the secondary alert was triggered in our system, confirming that the intervention hold had been executed and the board of directors had been notified. On the morning the acquisition was supposed to close, the office felt like a pressure cooker. Executives from the upper floors were pacing through the operations department, whispering to each other and holding cups of coffee. At 8 o'clock sharp, the team from Stonehaven Holdings dialed into the final closure call. I was not invited to join, and my name was not mentioned in the preparation notes. But my name was about to make a major appearance. At 8:17, the joint meeting was halted. The voice on the speaker belonged to Rachel Shu, our firm's internal counsel. She was a meticulous and demanding attorney who had no tolerance for sloppy work. She cleared her throat and announced that they had encountered a major obstacle. Bradley looked surprised and asked what the problem was. Rachel explained that the Stonehaven acquisition portal was blocked by our own systems. She shared her screen, showing the open transaction window. The system was stalled on a box labeled Certifier Validation Required, and the signature block showed my name, Jeffrey Vance, and my token identification. A second warning box indicated that Clause 8.1 had been invoked on Transaction 44B for the amount of $10 million, blocking the risk sign-off. Rachel stated that they could not proceed under the intervention lock because the certifier's token was active and no override permissions existed. Bradley's face turned red, and he muttered that it must be a technical glitch in an old system protocol, claiming that I was no longer involved in the deal. Rachel responded coolly, pointing out that legacy or not, the clause was legally binding under our corporate charter. She added that the system showed 6 separate override attempts from Bradley's account, all of which had been rejected. The shared screen displayed the log of every failed attempt, showing his username and the system rejection message. Roger Albright then unmuted his microphone. His voice was calm but cold. He said he had been assured that all compliance checks were complete, and he wanted to know what Bradley had planned to do if the database had allowed the transaction to pass. Bradley stammered, saying they had assumed the token would expire since my role had been adjusted. Roger replied that it was interesting that I had responded to his email. I had responded to his email with a full compliance memo, while Bradley's updates had gone unanswered. Bradley insisted that he could fix the issue if they gave him 5 minutes. Rachel cut him off immediately. She told him that he was not the registered certifier, and therefore he had no power to change the system settings. From my desk 3 floors down, I refreshed my system dashboard. The lock was still engaged, and the audit logs showed the latest escalation. My private Slack channels were filled with frantic messages from junior staff asking why my token was still active and if the closing would be delayed. I opened my log and wrote a new entry. 8:22 in the morning, full system halt, Bradley exposed, formal escalation to the board. In the conference room, Bradley was pacing in circles, asking if the information technology team could manually remove my token from the database. Rachel gave a dry laugh and asked him if he wanted her to read the federal statutes on corporate fraud, explaining that a manual override of a single-point certifier token would be a direct violation of Section 302 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. She warned him that bypassing these internal controls carried severe legal penalties. The room went completely silent. Bradley sat down, looking defeated. The phone call came at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was not from the legal department, and it was certainly not from Bradley. It was from Evelyn Stone, the chairwoman of our board of directors. Evelyn was a seasoned executive who knew how to handle corporate crises. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She began by stating that they were facing a total freeze on the $70 million acquisition by Stonehaven Holdings. The buyer's legal team was furious because the transaction status had stalled in their portal. She noted that their record showed I was the only person who held the active validation token required to clear the database hold. She offered to bring me in immediately as a special compliance advisor with appropriate compensation. I did not hesitate. I told her that my advisory rate was $25,000. Evelyn paused, then asked if that was per day. I told her it was indeed $25,000 per day. I also added that I would require complete access to the board of directors, including observation rights and the opportunity to speak during strategic sessions. Evelyn agreed, saying she would have the contract sent to my inbox within the hour. By 10:20 in the morning, an emergency closed-door meeting was called, and I was connected to the call remotely. Bradley was already present in the conference room, sitting with a red face and a loose tie. Evelyn entered the room last, carrying her tablet like a weapon. She looked directly at Bradley and told him to leave the room. Bradley stammered, pointing out that he was the acting chief operating officer and needed to oversee the resolution. Evelyn cut him off, stating that he had overseen the worst compliance failure the firm had experienced in a decade. She told him his presence was not required and that they would contact him when they were finished. He stood up slowly and walked out of the room, looking completely defeated while his hand-picked associates sat in silent horror. Evelyn then announced to the directors that I had agreed to consult at a rate of $25,000 per day, and that I would observe all board meetings for the rest of the quarter. One of the directors asked if I would authorize the transaction. I told them I would do so only after I had reviewed all the financial files properly to ensure there were no other hidden liabilities. They quickly agreed, and the meeting ended. But the real confrontation happened later that afternoon during the final closure meeting. At 4 o'clock, CEO Peter Gale joined the video call from his remote location. Peter was wearing a casual linen shirt, looking like he had just stepped off a private yacht. He was smiling and suggested they close the deal quickly so they could celebrate. Evelyn spoke first, telling Peter that the Stonehaven acquisition was completely frozen because Bradley had bypassed the compliance protocols, causing the system to lock the final $10 million payment. Peter was shocked, asking why they had not simply resolved the technical issue with the IT team. The chief financial officer explained that the only registered certifier had declined to sign and that a manual override would violate federal law. That was when my name appeared on the shared screen in large font. Peter sighed and asked if they had paid me. I unmuted my microphone and announced my presence. Peter tried to smooth things over, claiming there had been a simple miscommunication. I corrected him, stating that there was no miscommunication, only Bradley's arrogance and a compliance memo that Peter had failed to read. Peter asked what else I wanted to clear the transaction. I told him that I required a permanent seat on the board of directors. The silence on the call was heavy enough to crack concrete. After a few seconds, Evelyn spoke up, agreeing to my terms and welcoming me to the board. I then accessed my secure terminal, entered my validation token, and cleared the transaction. The Stonehaven deal was unlocked in less than 20 seconds. The chief financial officer confirmed that the funds had been released and the buyers were notified. Across the firm, the news of my promotion spread like a shockwave. The operations team members were whispering about how the person Bradley had tried to push out of the company had just been promoted above him. I returned to my office and opened a new document, labeling it Board Session Notes. As I began typing, I looked out the window at the city skyline and thought about how Bradley had told me to hang back at my desk. I had done exactly what he asked, and the entire operations department had fallen into my lap. Bradley was let go by the end of the week, his career tarnished by the compliance reports and the record of his failed override attempts. He had tried to make me invisible, but in the end, he was the one who disappeared. I sat back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my hot tea. The operations database was secure, the transaction was complete, and the vault was under my absolute control. There was no need for loud arguments or corporate buzzwords. I had let the system do the talking for me, and the system had spoken clearly. I saved my files, shut down my computer, and walked out of the building.